Then don't forget the Christmas list. We want to put some things in the prophet's chamber, and so plan to be here for that. We'll have the Christmas tree up down there, and then look at the bulletin, make sure you bring the food to go with those things, and then Sunday night we will not have a 6 o'clock service. So we'll have the meal after the morning service, but not 6 o'clock. And then Monday morning, the teenagers leave for the Wilds, 7:30 in the morning, so make sure you're here a little bit early so he can leave. And then our memory verse, Romans 5:8. So let's say that together, the reference, the verse, and then the reference. Romans 5:8. But God commends His love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. There you go. Okay. Romans 5:8, a great verse, and just reminding us what God did for us while we were still sinners, that He demonstrated His love toward us. Even while we were sinners. He didn't wait for us to respond to Him. He responded to us. All right, let's turn to Romans chapter 7. And if you are going to Summer Kids Club tonight, we'll let you go ahead and make your way out. The age for that is 3-year-old to whatever, normally 6th, 5th, 4th. It's kind of one of those fluctuating things. So 6th grade? Sure. Either. No, I don't. We kind of made that one of those things that's not kind of hard and fast during the summer because we had some young people that should go to Kids Club. So... All right, so Romans 7, Wednesday night, we took the time. By the way, any other announcements, anything that I missed? I always learn stuff when I ask that. Anything else going on? Anything exciting in your life taking place? Nice weather this week. Bill?
USA Today, we distributed that product to the store. They had a special flyer for Woodstock. It was 50 years ago. And since you're doing this on sanctification, I just remembered how all the hopes that people fought were with Woodstock.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, if this is the best man can do without God,
yes.
It's a disaster because look where we are 50 years from Woodstock and all what they thought was love and all this other things. And these people that basically participated in the demonstrations against Vietnam and everything, there are people now are actually in government now.
Yes. Yeah, and they hijacked all that terminology, love, peace, and they really hijacked Christian terminology and tried to make that something different. Yeah, good. Yeah. All right, anything else? Any words of wisdom tonight? Grammy, are they treating you well? Okay, all right, good. All right. Yeah. That's right. Great grandbaby, yeah.
Graduated from his finger therapy today.
Yes, all right.
Big step.
Big step. So how's the movement? Oh, looking good. Okay.
They haven't come down all the way.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah. You can't make a fist and punch me that way. Got the other one.
Turn the other cheek.
So now they work. He'll be back on his computer. Yeah. Okay, Romans 7. We were in this passage on Sunday night, and the end of this is a passage that's known fairly well. And so I'm going to throw some things up here that we looked at Sunday night, and then we're going to go through the rest of the passage. Because if we don't do that, we're going to get kind of caught up and left hanging a little bit with some things. And so when you look at Romans 7, it actually refers back to chapter 6, verse 14. And chapter 6, verse 14 says, "For sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace." And he says you as a believer are under grace. And we'll talk more about grace. But he says you're not under the law. And he's not talking about the fact that the law doesn't apply. In other words, he's not saying that the law is not still the law. That's not what he's trying to communicate. But he's saying you're not being molded by the law. The law can't make you righteous, and the law can't make you holy. You've got to figure out some way to do this. But he talks about that in chapter 6, verse 14, and then he comes back to that topic in chapter 7. So you'll see in chapter 7, verse 1, he says, "Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives." It has jurisdiction over him as long as he lives. So the law does have jurisdiction. He says the law is the law, and those laws are there. And so he goes on in verses 1 through 6, and he makes some points about how you are no longer under the law when you die. And he uses an illustration, and his illustration is about a spouse dying. And here's the conclusion that he comes to. We're not going to go through the whole thing. We did it Sunday night. But he said, the believer belongs to another, much like a widow to a new husband. So the believer doesn't belong to law anymore. You're not married to law anymore. You have something different. Then he goes on in verse 7 and he says, let me tell you a little bit more about this. He said, let me give you a little bit of a testimony. So in verse 6, he starts talking about the fact that the believer cannot be made holy by the law. So even as a Christian, I can't be holy based on the law because I don't have the capacity to keep it. I'm still a sinner. I'm still not in the position where I do everything that God wants me to do. I have struggles that I still face as a believer. Then another thing he points out is the law actually arouses sin. Now, that doesn't mean that the law itself is sin, but the law is what makes me realize that I'm a sinner. And he uses the illustration of coveting. He said, once the law said I can't covet, I know that when I covet, I'm a sinner. And so the law, the rule isn't the problem, but my failure to obey it points out my sinfulness. Here's the third thing that he says. He says, man's natural response to specific commands manifest our true nature. When I hear the law about coveting, my nature is to want to covet. If you were here Sunday night, I told you about the tattoo parlor. You know, I have no interest in getting a tattoo until, and I have no interest in going into a tattoo parlor until they put some rules out that said you can't go into the tattoo parlor. Then I wanted to go in just to see what it was. We have this natural response sometimes to the specific commandments. And so, what he's teaching us here is the believer is not made holy by the law. We have some struggles that we're going to face even as believers. And I still can't keep the law even though I'm saved, even though I have trusted Christ as Savior. I'm not going to be perfect. Now, before he moves on and he tells us how to solve this problem, in verses 15 through 20, he's going to go directly to the conflict and he's going to say to you basically, I want you to understand what's going on in your life. I want you to understand the struggle that you're having, the conflict. It's about two natures. And the problem is my sin nature is very alive. All right, so verses 15 through 20, I need a good dramatic reader tonight. All right, so who's a good, good just, you're going to take this on as a reader this evening. All right, let's see. Mike, I see that hand. There you go. All right, good. Yeah. So, well, wait. Which do you have it in? Do you have New American Standard? What do you?
New American Standard.
I tell you, let's get this in King James because that's just so flowery in this passage. Okay, all right. You got to be Paul, though.
I'm sorry?
You got to be Paul, though.
That's probably not.
Well, okay. We'll give it a shot. Okay, go ahead, Tasha.
15 through 20, right?
Yes.
For that which I do, I allow not. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that do I. If then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that it is good. Now then, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. For to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. Now if I do that I would not, it is no more that I do it, but sin that dwelleth in me.
Okay, it's kind of like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. So, what did he say? Can you boil that down to just a little statement? Eric?
Left to my own devices, I'm always going to do what's wrong.
Okay, left to my own devices, I'm just always going to do what's wrong. But wait, you're saved. So that's no longer true, right? No, this is Paul saying this. So he says, I want you to understand, I have the same conflict that you're having. I have the same struggle that you're having. So let's go through this in a little bit of detail so that we get exactly what he's saying. And I am going to put it up here in New American Standard because it does modernize it a little bit, although it's kind of fun to read in that King James English, all right? So here in verse 15 he says, "For what I am doing, I do not understand." Do you ever feel that way about yourself? Anybody ever feel that way? I don't even understand why I did that. I don't understand why I reacted that way. I don't understand why I let myself do that. And what's the word that often comes after that? I don't know why I let myself do that again. Yeah. Paul said, you know, what I'm doing, I don't even understand what I'm doing. For I am not practicing what I would like to do. I know what I would like to do, and I'm not practicing it. But I am doing the very thing I hate. But if I do the very thing I do not want to do, I agree with the law, confessing that the law is good. Now that statement has perplexed me a little bit. I've read a couple of commentaries on it, trying to figure out exactly what's he trying to say there. So let's get to that, but let's look at the top of this first. Because, do you remember when we looked at this before, I told you that back in, I think it is verse 7. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid, nay, I had not known sin. If you follow the tenses through there, he has third person and second person, and then verse 6 he has first person plural, we. But when he gets to verse 7, it's first person. He starts talking about himself. You know, I. Well, this goes even beyond first person. Not really beyond first person in its actual tense, but this is intensely personal. This is Paul being as open as a man can be. He's looking at his readers and he's saying, you know, guys, I don't even understand what I do sometimes. This is the Apostle Paul. I don't understand my own actions at times because I'm not practicing the things that I want to practice, and I'm doing the things that I don't want to do. And so here he is sharing with you, sharing with me this intensely personal struggle that he's having. And I think the Holy Spirit had him do it because he knows that this is the same thing that you and I, even as believers, are going to face. That there are many times when I don't even understand myself. I don't understand why I react and act the way that I do. All right, so keep looking at that, and let's get to the last part of this. I'm doing the very thing that I hate. So I'm doing what I hate. And so he said, but if I do the very thing I don't want to do, so if I'm doing what I don't want to do, here's his conclusion. I agree with the law, confessing that the law is good. What does he mean by that statement at the end? I'm curious what comes to your mind when you read that. Eric?
So, I read that, and we need the law because we need a boundary. We do not naturally stay within the boundary of doing right.
Okay.
If we always did right naturally, we wouldn't need a boundary, there would be no need for the law.
Yes. Good. Very good. Okay. All right. Anybody else? I do the wrong thing, and so what that means is I agree with the law. I confess that the law is good. Ruth?
Without the law, would I recognize my actions as not being good?
Okay. Yeah. And very similar to what Eric is saying, but the same idea. The law itself, the fact that I know I'm not doing the right thing, means that I recognize what the right thing is. I know that I'm not doing right. And I think there are a lot more people that know this than acknowledge that they know this. Even believers. I think there are believers that are involved in the wrong kind of music, watching the wrong kinds of programs, involved in the wrong kind of activities. And I think they know that those things really don't please the Lord, but they've kind of rationalized themselves out of it, rationalized themselves beyond it. So it's kind of interesting. The actual word that he uses for saying, I confess that the law is good, that word right at the very end in the New American Standard, it means that the law is beautiful or noble or it's excellent. I acknowledge, when I have this struggle, the struggle acknowledges that the law just is noble. It is upright, or it's excellent, it's beautiful. It's something that I have as a goal. I know what I want to do. Back in verse 12, he had used a different word to describe the law, and he actually said back in verse 12, wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, and just, and good. In English, it comes out as the same word, good, but back there it actually means it's useful or it's upright. It's useful to me. It is upright. But here, it's more of a descriptive phrase. It's something that's noble. I have affirmed that the law is something that I know I need to abide by. Okay, well, let's keep going. Go to verse 17. And verse 17 says, so now, no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For the willing is present with me, but the doing of the good is not. So if you were in my position tonight, and you were standing up front, what would you say about this verse? What are some things that are significant that we ought to think through here? There are several things, so you probably won't be wrong here if you pick one out. What would you say? That's an interesting point that he makes, very characteristic of man. Jason? Okay, what do you mean by that? So are you not responsible? That was very political. We're through at the Mueller hearings today. You are until you aren't. Okay, all right? Okay, I saw another hand over here. Carol.
I think the phrase, nothing good dwells in me, is very telling.
What do you mean, nothing good dwells in me? Come on.
None of us want to admit that. We think of ourselves as being good, right?
We do tend to think of ourselves as being good. We tend to measure other people by us, and sometimes we even measure God by us. And Paul is saying, I came to the realization when I compared myself to the law that there's nothing good that dwells in me, what resides in me. And he's going to define this a little bit more. But he said, I don't have a lot of good in there. And you'll say, well, I do good things, but why do people do good things sometimes? Is it because they want to give God the glory? Mike? Either somebody expects them to do it. All right? What else?
Or they have a guilty feeling because they did something bad.
Okay, to assuage guilt.
I feel better about myself because I did something wonderful.
I'm going to do something good for someone else because it makes me feel better. Jason? Recognition. Eric?
An excuse for not needing salvation.
Yeah. I can put off what I know I really need to do because look what I did. I don't need saved. I'm a good person. But Paul said, I am saved. I'm a believer. But even as a believer, I've recognized that there is no good things that dwells in me. He's going to refine that a little more. He's going to say, in my flesh. And we will get to that. All right? What else? There are a couple of other things in here that we really should throw out and say, okay, we need to make sure we understand that. All right? Daryl, you moved. I almost called on you. It's like an auction, Over there! Hey, how about when he says, for the willing is present with me. What does he mean by the willing is present with me? Aaron?
You want to have good intentions. You want to be
Yeah. Yeah, I often don't question people's intent. I think a lot of people intend to come to church. I think a lot of people intend to do a lot of good things. I think a lot of people intend to abide by the guidelines that God gives. And Paul says, the willing is present with me. I'm willing to get up at 5:30 and have my devotions mentally. It's just my body doesn't want to. So I don't do that. All right, so you look at this, and he's making a point. He's trying to just get across. And again, this is intensely personal. This is one of the places where he really couldn't point to somebody and say, well, I've been watching Jesse, and, I know Jesse's a good guy, but, he is, there's nothing good that dwells in him. Well, it's a little hard to use someone else as an illustration of that. And so this is really one of those places where Paul says, I'm just going to tell you what's going on in my own life. So now, no longer am I the one doing it. Now, he's not saying I'm not responsible. I asked Jason, does that mean he's not responsible for his sin? He's going to clearly say, yes, I am. But he's going to make a point about what's going on. He says, I'm not the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. And somebody could say, oh, you mean the devil made me do it. No, it's my own problems inside me. I am my biggest problem. I have said that to people and made them mad before. But the truth is, in almost every case, I am my biggest problem. It's not the people around me. It's not my spouse. It's not my kids. It's not my coworkers. I am the biggest problem. And so it's sin which dwells in me. And so here's what he's saying. I have a disposition towards sin. Eric got it when he said this is what's taking place. I have a disposition toward sin. I am disposed to sin. I want to sin. That's my nature. And I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. What does he mean when he says, in my flesh? Most of you are pretty familiar with the term. We often talk about the fact that we have the flesh and the spirit. But we do need to know, what's he mean by the Spirit? How would you define this flesh? And its technical, its word is sark. Can you think of any words, English words, that have sark in them that are flesh? Sarcophagus is the one that comes to my mind. A sarcophagus is where we put the flesh of man. In a box, basically. That's the root of the word. And so when he puts this word up here, it's the word, the tense here is sarky, but it's actually sark, sarcophagus. We use CH instead of K. But what is the flesh? What does he mean when he says, no good thing dwells in me, that is, in my flesh? So he refines that a little bit and says, now I want you to understand, I'm talking about my flesh. Doesn't have anything good in it. Carol?
When we're saved, we have an old nature and a new nature, and the flesh would be the old nature.
Okay, all right, that's a good way to put it. You have the old nature and the new nature, and the old nature would be that flesh. Mike?
Isn't the flesh the curse that I inherit from Adam and Eve?
Okay, so the sin nature itself, the cursed nature from Adam and Eve, that would be from Adam, we have to say. Yeah, that would... Yeah, but it was Adam. Yeah, those men. Yeah. Yeah. So, in the Bible, we have flesh actually used three ways. One is obvious. What is it? Your physical body, the sarcophagus, the physical body. This is a body of flesh. The second way, so it's physical existence, a body. The second way actually talks about physical descent. You'll find a couple of times, even here in Romans, if you go back to chapter 1, verse 3, and then forward to chapter 9, verse 3, where he talks about descendants of my flesh. And he's talking about the fact that my fleshly descendants, the fact that I came from flesh and blood, and this is who I am. But then this third one is the one that he's talking about here. It's the personality controlled by sin for selfish pursuits. Now, I have a lot of different definitions of the flesh. This is not the one that I would have you memorize. I actually stole this one from somebody else for this passage. The personality controlled by sin for selfish pursuits. How many of you know the little ditty that says, "Only two choices on the shelf"? What's the rest of it? Beth? Yeah, pleasing God and pleasing self. Only two choices on the shelf. Pleasing God and pleasing self. And that's really what happens inside us. Pleasing self is pleasing the flesh. I'll do what I want to do. I have selfish pursuits. And so when he says, "no good thing dwells in me," he does refine that a little bit and say, that is inside this old man, this personality controlled by sin for selfish pursuits. There's not a good thing that's in there. It's just not. I mean, it's constantly pushing me in the wrong direction. And so when he mentions the flesh, he mentions it in a very negative way. I've got a couple of passages up there. If you look at verse 23, 25. I was going to say 23 doesn't have anything in there. Verse 25. "I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, with the mind, I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh, the law of sin." So he's talking about the same thing. He's going to end the chapter coming back to this word, and then he's going to go into chapter 8, and he's going to talk a lot more about that. He says, with my flesh, I tend to serve the law of sin. That's what my flesh does. Let's jump forward to chapter 8. It'll be a month before we get there. It'll be actually be the end of August, beginning of September, but go to chapter 8, verse 5. "For they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, but they that are after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded," and that's the ideas there is fleshly minded, "is death. But to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal or the fleshly mind is hostile against God." It's enmity against God. "For it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. So then, they that are in the flesh cannot please God." So he's making a very clear point here. If you are living in the flesh, if you're allowing this personality controlled by sin for selfish pursuits, if you as a believer are allowing the flesh to control you, you are at enmity with God. You're hostile toward God. You can't please Him. You've got to figure out how to get rid of that flesh. And what he's going to say in chapter 8 is, you've got to yield to the Spirit. You've got to let the Holy Spirit control you. Galatians chapter 5, verses 16 through 25 deals extensively with this battle between the flesh and the Spirit. We have gone through that not too long ago in church, but he says, here are the manifestations of the flesh, and he gives us a whole list of things. And then remember, that's the passage where he says, "and such like," things like this. The flesh manifests itself in so many different ways. And you can understand what the flesh is by looking at those examples. And so here he is talking about this flesh. And he said, I want you to understand that I have a battle going on. There's nothing good that dwells in my flesh. I understand, you have to understand that I'm willing. The willing is present with me. But the doing of the good is not. How do I get from wanting to do the right thing to actually doing the right thing? That's a good question. A very legitimate question, and one that we have to constantly entertain in our own lives. All right, so let's keep going. Verse 19. "For the good that I want, I do not do. But I practice the very evil that I do not want. But if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one that doing it, but sin which dwells in me." Now, his point again is not that he is it excuses him for his sin. He says, well, it's not my fault because it's my sin nature. I just had to do it. But he's saying, I want you to understand, I know the battle that you're facing. I know how difficult it seems sometimes to overcome some of the struggles that you're facing. I do. I fully understand that. And you have a sin nature that is really strong. This really simply repeats. It's interesting that he takes the time to do this because he's already said this once. But he says, I'm going to say it again, this intensely personal statement. The good that I want to do, I don't do it. But I practice the very evil that I don't want to do. It's a restatement of what he's already said. So he says, but if I'm doing the very thing I don't want to do, I'm no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. And so there's an irrefutable truth here. What is the irrefutable truth about believers that I have to accept about myself? Jason? You're still going to sin. Let's take it a little bit further. You're still going to sin. There's no doubt about that. What is the irrefutable truth about me that I have to acknowledge in order to be victorious? Kara? We have a problem. All right? What is our problem? That's it. Right there. Yeah. She got the next one. Believers have an indwelling principle of sin that constantly expresses itself. Now think about that statement. We like to think that once we get saved, life is always going to be great. I'm not going to really have any more problems. I'm going to be kind of angelic. Well, we know that's not true. We've evidenced that. That's because believers still have an indwelling principle of sin that constantly expresses itself. How many of you feel that? Yeah. I don't want to ask, and so I'm going to try to give you some examples of this, but if I were to ask and we were to have this kind of just bluntness, this intensely personal discussion like Paul is having, what are some areas where people really struggle in this? Maybe I could do it this way, not you, but what examples would you give of where people have this indwelling principle of sin that constantly expresses itself? And we've often talked about this. Jim Berg calls them designer lust. There are things that will tempt you that don't tempt me, and things that would tempt me that might not tempt you. So we all have our own lusts. But what are some specific things that you've seen people struggle with where this indwelling principle of sin constantly expresses itself? People can't seem to get over some of these things. Can you give me any examples? Aaron?
Hi, my name is Tim. I'm a pastor of preaching here at Grace Baptist Church, and I just want to invite you to join us some Sunday. I know you'll find a warm group, a family of Christians that will embrace you and help you to grow in your Christian faith. We're actually right in the middle of Queens, Forest Hills, and just like Queens, our church is very diverse as well. People from all over the world, many different ethnicities, languages, food, and even situations, life, ages, all kind of mixed together to form a healthy, vibrant body. And we wanted you to join with us. It's interesting how the church is kind of like made up of all these different jewels, right? We all have these different backgrounds that we bring to the table, and the Lord is shaping us, fashioning us to what He wants us to be. And He wants to shape you as well. He may use a chisel. He may use pressure, and sometimes that doesn't feel so good. But it's all to make you more like Jesus. And when we meet on Sunday, it's like He's bringing us all together, shaping us, fashioning us into a diadem or a crown to fit on the head of the church, the King of Kings, Jesus. And so when we meet together, we need you to join too, to be a sparkling jewel in that crown, to worship the Lord. So please come and take part. You may say, well, what is Grace Baptist Church like?